By July 1877, Pittsburgh had become something specific, a city built on railroads and steel, a place where wages determined survival. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic photographs to life, allowing us to move through Pittsburgh as it appeared in July 1877. What you're about to see is how a wage cut ignited the first nationwide strike in American history. This is Pittsburgh in early 1877. Population 156,000. The city was a railroad hub. Over 20 rail lines converged here. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest employer. Thousands worked in the yards and shops. The air carried coal smoke. Locomotives arrived constantly. The sound of coupling cars echoed through the streets. This was normal. This was prosperity. Workers earned modest wages. Skilled mechanics made $12 per week. Firemen earned $9. Brakemen earned less. These wages supported families. Rent consumed half of what a worker made. Food consumed the rest. The Pennsylvania Railroad had cut wages once already. This happened in 1876. Workers accepted it. The Depression had begun in 1873. Jobs were scarce. Workers had little choice. Then came the second cut. In June 1877, the Pennsylvania Railroad announced another reduction. Wages would drop 10%. This was the second cut in 12 months. For many workers, this meant poverty. A mechanic earning $12 would now earn less than $11. The mathematics were simple. Families would go hungry. The railroad gave no advance notice. The cut would take effect immediately. Workers were told at the end of their shifts. There was no negotiation, there was no discussion. This is what triggered the events of July 1877. On the morning of July 19, freight workers at the Pennsylvania Railroad shops stopped working. They were not organized. There was no union. They simply refused to move trains. The stoppage was spontaneous. By afternoon, the entire freight yard was idle. No trains moved. The Pennsylvania Railroad carried freight across the entire state. The stoppage in Pittsburgh halted this flow. Perishable goods sat in cars. Western cattle bound for eastern markets were trapped. The animals bellowed in the heat. The railroad called the local militia. The militia assembled that evening. They marched to the 28th Street crossing. This is where freight trains left the city. Workers had blocked the tracks. A crowd surrounded the crossing. The militia faced them. The local militia commander ordered the crowd to disperse. They refused. He ordered his men to clear the tracks. They refused. The local militia was composed of Pittsburgh workers. Many had relatives in the crowd. Some were railroad workers themselves. They would not fire on neighbors. The militia withdrew without firing. The railroad had lost control. The Pennsylvania Railroad contacted the governor. Governor John Hartranft was in Wyoming. He was attending the anniversary of a Civil War battle. He sent orders immediately. Mobilize the Philadelphia militia. Send them to Pittsburgh. The Philadelphia troops were different. They had no connection to Pittsburgh. They had no relatives among the strikers. They were professional soldiers. 600 men boarded trains on July 21. They arrived in Pittsburgh the next morning. This is July 22, 1877. The Philadelphia militia marched to the 28th Street crossing. The crowd had grown overnight. Estimates varied widely. Some said 6,000 people, others claimed 20,000. The exact number was never determined. Not all were railroad workers. Families had joined. Women stood with their husbands. Children watched from the edges. Unemployed men from the steel mills stood with them. The Depression had created thousands of idle workers. They saw the railroad's action as their struggle too. The militia formed ranks. They fixed bayonets. The crowd pressed closer. Someone threw a stone, then another. The rocks struck the militia line. The militia commander ordered the crowd back. They did not move. At approximately 4 p.m., the order was given. The militia opened fire. They fired directly into the crowd. The shooting lasted several minutes. The sound was deafening. Rifles cracked in volleys. Smoke drifted across the crossing. People fell. Others ran. Some stood frozen. The militia continued firing. 20 people fell dead. More than 70 were wounded. Among the dead were women. Among the dead were children. A boy of 14 was shot in the back. An older man was killed standing on his porch. He was not part of the crowd. He was watching from his home. The militia retreated to the Pennsylvania Railroad Roundhouse. The roundhouse was a massive brick building. It housed locomotives for repair. The militia barricaded themselves inside. The crowd surrounded the building. The crowd's mood had changed. Before the shooting, this was a labor dispute. After the shooting, this was war. The siege began immediately. Thousands surrounded the roundhouse. Some had weapons. Hunting rifles appeared. Pistols were drawn. Shots were fired at the roundhouse windows. Glass shattered. The militia returned fire. The exchange continued for hours. Then someone brought oil. The crowd soaked railroad cars in kerosene. They pushed the cars against the roundhouse walls. They set them ablaze. The fire spread quickly. Flames climbed the wooden car frames. Black smoke billowed into the evening sky. The roundhouse was not the only target. The crowd moved through the railroad yards. They set fire to everything. Freight cars burned first, then passenger cars, then locomotives. The fires spread across the yards. The smell of burning wood mixed with coal smoke. The heat intensified. By midnight, the sky over Pittsburgh glowed orange. Flames reached 100 feet high. The heat could be felt blocks away. Windows cracked from the temperature. Explosions echoed through the city as fuel tanks ignited. Each blast sent sparks into the night. The destruction was methodical. The crowd did not loot. They burned. Building after building was set ablaze. The railroad's machine shops burned. The grain elevators burned. The freight depot burned. Molten metal ran from the foundries. The fire consumed decades of construction. By morning, the count began. 39 buildings had been destroyed. 104 locomotives were damaged or destroyed. Over 1,200 freight and passenger cars were gone. The Pennsylvania Railroad estimated losses at $5 million. The Philadelphia militia remained trapped in the roundhouse. The fire had not reached them, but the heat was severe. Smoke filled the building. Water was scarce. The troops had not eaten since the previous morning. They could hear the fires outside. They could hear the crowd. At dawn on July 23, the militia made their decision. They would break out. They formed columns. They fixed bayonets. They marched out the doors into the smoke. The crowd parted. Some shouted, some threw stones, but no one fired. The militia marched through the streets. They walked 28 miles to Sharpsburg. Families watched from doorways. The troops moved in silence. From Sharpsburg, they took trains back to Philadelphia. Pittsburgh was still burning. The fires continued for 3 days. No one fought them. The fire companies could not reach the flames. The crowds blocked the streets. Smoke hung over the city like fog. Ash fell continuously. It coated everything. Federal troops arrived on July 24. President Hayes had mobilized them. This was the first use of federal troops against American workers in peacetime. 500 regulars marched into Pittsburgh. They carried loaded rifles. They had orders to restore order. The troops occupied the rail yards. They cleared the streets. They arrested suspected leaders. Over 100 men were detained. No trials followed. Most were released within days. The authorities could not prove who had started the fires. Witnesses would not testify. By July 28th, the strike in Pittsburgh was over. Freight trains moved again. Workers returned to their positions. The wage cut remained in effect. Nothing had changed for the workers. But the casualties were counted. Official reports listed 20 deaths from the militia shooting. Unofficial counts ranged higher. Some said 40. Bodies were found in the burned buildings. Not all were identified. Families buried their dead quietly. The wounded numbered over 100. Many lost limbs. Burns scarred others permanently. There was no compensation. The railroad paid nothing. The state paid nothing. Families cared for the injured themselves. Pittsburgh responded to the violence with construction. The state built armories throughout the city. These were fortified buildings. They housed militia weapons and supplies. The design was deliberate. Walls 3 feet thick, constructed of brick and stone. Windows were narrow slits, too small for a man to enter. Doors were reinforced iron. The buildings could withstand siege. Internal wells provided water. Storage rooms held weeks of food. Barracks could house 500 troops. The largest armory was built on the north side. It dominated the neighborhood. The structure resembled a medieval castle. Turrets rose from the corners. The roof was crenellated. The message was unmistakable. The state was prepared for war against its workers. These armories still stand. Some are museums now. Others are offices. But their purpose is remembered. They were not built to defend against foreign invasion. They were built to control workers. They were built after Pittsburgh burned. The events in Pittsburgh had spread. The strike had jumped to other cities. Baltimore erupted on July 20. 9 people died in street fighting. Chicago followed on July 23. 30 died in clashes with police. St. Louis workers took control on July 24. They held the city for 5 days. The pattern was identical everywhere. Wage cuts triggered strikes. Strikes triggered militia. Militia triggered violence. Violence triggered federal troops. Over 100 people died nationwide. Property damage exceeded $10 million. The federal response established precedent. Presidents could deploy troops against strikers. The army could occupy American cities. This power would be used repeatedly. In the Pullman strike of 1894, in the Colorado coal fields of 1914, in the steel strike of 1919, each time troops broke the strikes. The Great Railroad Strike changed labor organization. Workers learned that spontaneous action was not enough. Permanent unions were needed. Structure was needed. The Knights of Labor grew rapidly after 1877. Membership reached 700,000 by 1886. Organization replaced spontaneity. But Pittsburgh's railroad workers gained nothing immediate. The Pennsylvania Railroad did not restore wages. The company hired replacement workers. Many strikers never returned to their jobs. Blacklists circulated. Men who participated found employment difficult. Some left Pittsburgh entirely. Families struggled through the following winter. The wage cuts remained. Food prices did not decrease. Rent did not decrease. Children went to work instead of school. The strike had failed to change their circumstances. The armories remain. The walls still stand thick. The narrow windows still watch the streets. The message endures. Power responds to challenges with force. This was documented. This is preserved in stone. This is Pittsburgh in July 1877. Smoke rising from the railroad yards. Federal troops patrolling the streets. Workers returning to the same wages that sparked the strike. The modern labor movement did not begin gradually. It announced itself here, in the shooting on 28th Street, in the fires that consumed the rail yards, in federal troops occupying an American city. If there's another moment in industrial history you'd like to see brought back to life, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.